Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of the Book of Nook Show. My name is Kyle Colley and this is a special episode of Author Talks Podcast, a podcast to hear the behind the scenes stories, ideas, and writing journeys of authors. This episode is brought to you by Bookem, the book community's new and best way to host dynamic online book clubs. Download the app and start your book club today at www.bookemapp.com. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. My guest today is the legendary Randy Mills. Randy is the distinguished professor at Oakland City University since 1983, and he has written over 10 books. He is the author of the book we're talking about today, As If by Magic, a story about Larry Bird and his high school journey. He is a writer, a historian, a basketball fan, a former hooper, an Illinois native, a husband. Randy, welcome to the Author Talks podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. I kind of want to start with the trivia question because March Madness is happening right now. There is a player by the name of Cooper Flagg who plays for the Duke. He's the first player to lead his team in points, rebounds, and assists in the tournament so far. And if he continues, he'll be the first person to do it since two other people. Do you know who those two people are?
I do not.
One of them is Larry Bird. I
Is Larry
thought,
Bird?
I thought that might, I thought you
Yeah,
might take a
right.
shot there. And the other one is Jerry Stackhouse.
Okay. Wow. Wow. My interest in Larry, I've really got into the high school part of it, which
Yep.
nobody's looked at before, and I knew of his Indiana State and Boston Celtics and so forth. But as I grow older, I've kind of gone back into my generation, so I don't follow things perhaps like I should. Just live among the old stories.
Yeah, I love to see it. And speaking of those old stories, one of the things that captured me when I was reading this book, it's titled As If by Magic. So my brain when I first thought, I thought it was a reference to Magic Johnson, but there's a deeper historical meaning to that phrase. Can you talk about it from the Illinois perspective and where that came from, as if by magic?
Yes. Uh, Several people have mentioned that as, gee, I thought there was going to be Magic Johnson in this. And when I came up with that title, it just hit me as being the correct one, so much that that never entered my mind. So what you have to understand here, Kyle, is that Larry Bird appeared out of nowhere. I mean, out of nowhere. He played one varsity game when he was a sophomore. Uh, he played on a senior led team his junior year, and he was not the best player by far. There was a guy there that set all the records at his school during that time, and he was kind of the hero at the time. I talk about this in the book. And then his senior year, full-fledged Larry Bird. And so I was reading about that and trying to wrap my head around that. And I started seeing people who were there at the time who were, and then later on interviewed, talked about it. It was like somebody had waved a magic wand. That was Tony Clark, I think, that said that, one of his teammates. And then a sports writer talked about him as like a magician, just out of nowhere.
Mhm.
And it's still hard for me to wrap my head around it, though I can really speak to that having written about it. But it's just so odd that he would be not only good, really good by his senior year, but I mean doing all the stuff Larry Bird keeps on doing, the passing and everything. It's just like, where did that come from?
Yeah. And to that, when doing your research and because in the book you go through all this, the whole story, and you pull out information and got articles that from everywhere, and you're looking at his stat book. I mean, the score, with box score, and looking at all these things. What do you think really clicked for him that moment, and to make him have that such of a big jump in that time?
I don't think he saw it coming either, but he had already put in the magical ingredients had already been poured in there. Good coaching, two good exceptional coaches, and he was very blessed with both of them. They had one the junior year and one the senior year because they were very different. And Larry needed one his junior year, and then he needed something else his senior year and got it. I really believe if the one he had as the junior year had been coaching, we might not be talking about Larry Bird right now because he was a disciplinarian. When this guy left and the other guy came, he just let Larry go, which
Hmm.
That always at Indiana State with the Celtics and so forth, that was the way to go when you were using Larry. You had all of those things preparing him. He was trying to overcome a very difficult home life. They were perhaps the poorest family in a poor town, and they caught the kids caught some grief from that. I'm sure the father was an alcoholic, a good man, a hardworking man, but he had alcoholism, and that was an issue for that Larry had to deal with. So he was had those kinds of things. He another thing that helped him get there during this time that didn't make it magic. It was there, but you have to go back and look at it to understand it. Is his brother Mark and his brother Mike. He had two older brothers that just beat the crap out of him. They played sports. I mean, if there wasn't blood on the ground, they hadn't been playing whatever they were playing. And they became not only competitors for a younger Larry and pushed Larry to want to be better and catch up with him, but they also were models, especially Mark, who I went to college with,
Okay.
which is one of the reasons why I ended up writing about Larry. I knew Larry Bird when he was Mark Bird's brother.
Yep.
That's who he was. Hey, there's Mark Bird's brother. Of course, now that's completely turned. Got to feel a little sorry for Mark and all that. Uh, but the main thing, and this was magic in a sense because nobody could have made this happen. He grew 4 inches between his junior and senior year. And then he grew 2.5 more at Indiana State. He ended up being 6'9.5". He was 6'3" at the end of his junior year. And he was a good player. He was a second leading scorer at a senior-led team that was the best team Springs Valley had had up to that time, except first year they started when they went to state finals. So all of those things are coming together. And again, if just one of those things, one of those angles, and there were other people, perhaps we'll talk about them later, that were there when Larry needed him. If one of those things had been missing, I don't think we'd be sitting here talking about Larry Bird. He was very fortunate of how all these things fell together. But you got to wonder, don't you, how many guys are out there like that
Oh
that
yeah.
never made it, that could have if they'd had those right chances? I bet the world's full of them. And I hear these stories. I used to play a lot of independent basketball. There are a lot of independent leagues here in Indiana and Southern Illinois where I grew up. And there were always those guys that were great that they might have dropped out of high school or whatever. And you think, wow,
Yeah.
isn't that something? And nobody's heard of them.
Well, I'm glad you talked about the coaching part because I think coaching plays such a big point, especially in high school basketball, the way that you even develop your shot and the confidence. Because I remember Steph Curry talking about it yesterday or a couple days ago, where he's talking about as a shooter and just as a basketball player in general, you have to have a short-term memory. You almost have to have amnesia. So if you have a coach that's kind of really hard on you, or I think about like we'll go into him a little bit, but like a Bob Knight who is just a hard-nosed coach versus
Yes.
a different type of coach, you get different results from players. And some players need the hard coaching, but some need like maybe like Larry Bird, where he can once he gets going and allows him to play freestyle, he can get going. Talk to me a little bit about Jim Jones. I think that yeah, because he's one of the big coaches you kind of highlight in the beginning of the book. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yes. And it's interesting because I was going to start right there after what you had said. So Jim Jones was a disciplinarian, but he loved kids and he wanted them to be uh, good at what they did, and he expected them to have discipline because he knew discipline was what was needed to get you there, right? And so he was hardcore about that, but he would do everything to help you, and he was a very good coach when it came to fundamentals. Larry Bird says in his book Drive, his first autobiography about his life, that Jim Jones taught him everything he would ever use, passing, uh, uh, moves under the basket, just all sorts of things, right hand, left hand dribbling, you name it, shooting. Of course, Illinois, Southern Illinois, where I grew up in Indiana, very much alike. Coaches work with you with shooting. I don't know if that's done much anymore or not. I don't see it with my grandkids as much. But anyway, Larry had that going for him from Jim Jones. So Jim always said that no one player wins for a team. It's always teamwork. And he would throttle players back. He had a player named Steve Land in Larry's junior year that broke every Springs Valley scoring and rebounding record. And that's, as you know, is in the book. And Steve probably could have scored more points if Jim had turned him loose, but he didn't. And of course, the irony there is it enabled Larry to break all Steve's records the next year, and Steve ends up being forgotten. But that was Jim. So along comes Gary Holland, who's really easygoing,
Yep.
and he turns Larry loose. And so but I think Larry needed both that. He needed Jim Jones to give him that that drive. He often told Larry, he said, Larry, somebody's out there right now shooting basketball or dribbling, and you're not. If he saw Larry, start hanging it up, and that stuck with Larry. Larry said oftentimes, even later when he was playing for the Celtics and later, that thought that somebody was out there jogging a little bit longer, getting in shape, shooting two more shots, drove him crazy. And Jim Jones instilled that in him, and it was tackling fuel for him.
Yeah.
No,
And it's true because then you still have Magic Johnson across the way that there was that player that was training as hard as him too. And I think about when you're talking about coaches and the difference of what one coach can make. I think about a Michael Jordan who had Doug Collins, who was a great coach, right? And he ended up continuing to be a great coach. But when he left and you get Phil Jackson, now you have the triangle offense. You have all these things that change, and Jordan's game goes even further up, and he wins championships, right? So I think what you're talking about with Larry Bird and the switches of the coaches gave him that free range to play the way that we have seen him play as a basketball player.
yes, and imagine if Coach Jones had stayed around, we might not be talking about Larry Bird. And I really believe that. I believe those little things made the difference because he had so many things working against him.
Mm.
And there's an interesting story why Jim Jones didn't stick around. I mean, have you wondered about that? Gee, he quit coaching there for a while, and he could have had Larry his senior year. But again, that's a part of that no one saw it coming because he was good. He was 6'3", but he wasn't 6'7" and could do it all.
No. Can we talk a little bit about Mark? Because you talked about your relationship with him too. Like, how did his game impact Larry Bird and the impact that he saw how to play basketball at the right level? And just kind of talk a little bit about him as the older brother.
It was fun writing about Mark because I've got a chapter called Number 33 in the book, and everybody thinks it's going to be about Larry. It's about Mark.
Mm.
And in Springs Valley, it was the practice that brothers passed on their numbers. And so Larry, that's where number 33 came from Mark was a very good player. In his senior year, they were playing for the sectional final, and they had I think they won a little more than half their games, but they were in the final game. And Mark ended up he was having health problems, and he played through it, and he scored the winning free throws in that game. And Larry says in the book Drive that going to that game changed his life.
Mm.
Can you believe this? That Larry had not gone to any high school games, and he's a freshman now. And he goes to see his brother because he's shy and he's nervous around crowds. So he says, well, I got to go see my brother play because they're playing in the sectional, which is a big deal in Indiana. And he's there, and he says in his book, he said when he saw the applause and the honor that was paid Mark in their town and in their school, and then he got a scholarship to go to college. He was the first kid to go to college from that family, and they were very poor, so he wouldn't have been able to go without that. All of that made Larry say later, "Gee, I want that. I want that." In fact, he says in his book he was crying and he couldn't understand why he was crying, and it just hit him. He said, "I want that."
Yeah.
And so here's another part where Mark made a difference, but not just in that game. I really believe that Larry's jump shot came from Mark because he's always shagging balls for Mark. And if you see pictures of Mark, and I've got pictures of Mark in the book, him shooting, it looks like Larry letting go one of those corner shots. Yep. So yes, very important person. I knew Mark. He was a couple of years behind me, and I would go to the games, and I remember Larry coming to the games. He was maybe 6'1" then, and he just looked down at the ground. He wouldn't meet your eyes or anything. And they, oh, there's Mark Bird's brother. How about that?
Yeah, do you know when Larry officially started beating his brother in basketball? Was it during that big jump in his junior senior year?
Well, there's a story that Larry tells about that. So they have relatives up at the steel mills up around Lake Michigan, I think at Hobart, Indiana. And they would go up there in the summers and visit their families, or that family. So Larry had gone up there. Mark, while he was at Oakland City in the summers, he would go up there and work in one of the steel mills. So Larry had gone up there, and Mark hadn't seen him since his growth. And him and Mark and Larry and another kid that Larry brought up there played some street ball there in Hobart, and they just cleaned everybody's plow. But Mark made the comment. He said, "My gosh, you've gotten so much better. And how tall are you now?" And so I think that's when he realized what he was looking at. But you got to wonder a little bit, and even later, how Mark felt about all that, because, he was the one that everybody talked about and had the scholarship, and it was a big deal in their town. And now all of a sudden, in a very short time, Larry just, I mean, how would you like to be uh, Larry Bird's brother
Yeah.
in that regard? So
Well, as a younger brother, I can say we stand on the shoulders of our, I mean, we get to stand on the shoulders of our brothers and they get to kind of lead the way. So it is really great to see, like, I'm sure his older brother might, and he probably just loved seeing his brother become, as great as he was. Talk to me a little bit about the writing, because you write extensively about Indiana history in that at the time of the book. Like, how did Larry Bird's story fit into like the larger basketball culture of the state at the time, at all the different schools and all that?
Indiana has always claimed to be the have the best high school basketball in the country. And I'll see if you shake yes or no your head on that, because there's a lot of argument there. And I grew up in Illinois, which, they made the same claim, in Kentucky, certainly. Uh, so there was a long tradition of, and I think of Oscar Robertson as a key one, Damon Bailey, um, just a long line of really good Indiana players, many of whom did not do well in the pros.
Mm,
Uh, but if you look at the top, ESPN did the top 100 Indiana high school players, and I think Oscar Robertson was considered number one and Larry number two, which I would agree with myself. I saw Oscar play in college basketball, and he was just a
unbelievable.
man among kids. But anyway, uh, so Larry would have fit into that. I think where Larry doesn't really fit into that is he had no notoriety,
Mm,
hardly in Indiana, even after his senior year. He didn't make the All-Star team or the first team All-State. I think he was honorable mention. And it took a sports writer from Jasper, Indiana, in this area here, Larry's area, to kind of go out and talk to the coaches, because the coaches had the final say if they wanted to add anybody, and Larry got added, and he ended up doing really well there, but not as well as perhaps he would have if the coach had that coach that team had used him more. So that's Larry talks about that. There was some bitterness there in that whole process. Uh, and later on, Larry, and we're probably going to get to this, with this, after he dropped out of IU, he just fell off the map for a
mm.
while. And that's an interesting story. That's the last chapter in my book. It's called Larry
The
Bird's
lost
Lost
year.
Year.
Yep. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Larry Bird's playing style while he's still in high school. What was his playing style like? Like you said, those first couple years, and then how did it change in his senior year? Like, what were the different qualities in his game specifically?
So he played, and this is Indiana.
Yep.
And so everybody's good. Everybody's fundamentally good. Uh, if you're playing on any level and you're starting or on the traveling team, you've got decent skills. And Larry was a good player with a lot of other good players. His eighth grade year, and I went back through, I found some of the old box scores and articles in the newspapers when Larry was an eighth grader. I had their scorebook for his eighth grade year, And then I had some things from his freshman and sophomore year that I found in the paper. So in his eighth grade year, he gets kicked off the team about the second half of the season. And I wondered what that was about. And I looked at the score book and I kind of figured what it was. But anyway, Larry was very frustrated. The Bird boys were famous for having tempers. And he would get mad and cuss and throw the ball down and hollers at the refs. But he skipped practice, and that got him kicked off his eighth grade year. His freshman year, he came back and he played some. And even when you look at the seventh and eighth grade scoring of the few articles I could see, he was usually the leading scorer. And then in his freshman year, he says he didn't play that much. He may have lost out missing that eighth grade part. So at the beginning of his sophomore year, he broke his ankle.
Hmm.
So he wasn't even playing. And then he got put into a varsity game at the end of the season after he was able to play a couple of junior varsity games. So that gets us to his junior year. By his junior year, he's perfected his shot, but he's not shooting a lot. The big scorer, Steve Land, in those first 5 or 6 games against really tough competition, uh, Springs Valley won all their games and close games against teams that were starting out. Most of them were having their best teams ever. And so Springs Valley really had a good team, and it was senior led with Steve Land and Danny King and Tony Clark. And then there was a freshman on it named Brad Bledsoe, who had started as a freshman when Larry was a sophomore. So Larry wasn't, he was in the mix, but he wasn't anywhere near where he's at. I remember in reading newspaper articles about the beginning of his junior year, he's the last guy they talk about out of 13 guys that are going to play,
Oh,
if
wow.
that gives you any sense, because he just didn't have, nobody knew. And so somewhere along the line, I think Jim Jones saw his potential and he said, Larry, you need to shoot more. That was after the Jasper game, according to Larry. And Jasper was a big rival to the Larry Bird's high school team. And so he started shooting, but he was also passing. And so in looking at the old newspapers, all you see is land this, land that. But where you see Larry mentioned is in his passing. You
Mhm.
start seeing sports writers say, wow, I've never seen that passing is really good. And so he's a ball handler. He can shoot and he can pass. And he's 6'1" and he's become 6'3" and now he's maybe weighing 150 pounds. I would say that Larry, the last half of the second half of the season, Larry was becoming Larry Bird, but he
Yep.
was a 6'3" Larry Bird. And I think Jim Jones, that's how Jim Jones remembers Larry as being full-fledged Larry. I've just started thinking about this, Kyle, and I don't think anybody's ever caught it. But people that talk about Larry uh, in the present and they look back at the past of when he was in high school and when he was in Indiana State will say something like, wow, he was there at that moment, but he wasn't. Jim Jones speaks of him as junior year as being like that. Go through the box scores. No, nobody's talking about him. I mean, you can see toward the end of the season, he starts being one of the leading scorers, but he's still not the leading scorer. So people project from the future to the past on Larry
Of course.
because he becomes, I guess it's like Abe Lincoln. I'm sure Abe Lincoln didn't know what he was doing at some point in time. And yet everybody had stories about him at some point in time, like he was out of the womb like that.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, it was a process, and I think his junior year you begin seeing it. But I'm back to Jim Jones. If Jim Jones had seen that the way he claimed he saw it, he would not have quit. He would have wanted that ride, right?
Yeah, of course.
He would have wanted that ride. And so he quits coaching. He's the athletic director. And the next guy, uh, Gary Holland told me this story. Gary Holland said when Jim announced his retirement at the end of Larry's junior year, he said he came up he told all the coaches, he said, I'm not going to be coaching. He said, Gary, you're probably going to be the coach. And then Gary said, Jim Jones walked up to me and put his hand on my chest and whispered in my ear. He didn't want to mess with him. That Larry and the guys that he was with were kind of the poor people in town, and they had a rough edge, and they liked, you know, to party and fight and things of that. Not in a really bad way, but in a way that would bother a strict disciplinarian like Jim Jones. And of course, Gary Holland was just perfect for that.
Yeah, see.
Um,
But did
but
you go ahead, go ahead.
but another thing to that. So at the beginning of Larry's senior year, he's 6'7",
Mm,
but nobody's picking them to win over half their games.
mm,
And so I don't think anybody knows Larry Bird yet. It's going to be Larry Bird, but you start seeing that by you see it real quick in the scoring. But what really turns things around, I think, is their fifth game against Jasper again. And uh, Larry just became Larry Bird that night, and he stayed that way the rest of the time. If you had to pick a moment, that was the moment when Larry and everybody realized,
yeah,
wow, I'm this way, and I'm going to keep being this way. I
yeah,
remember talking to a player that played against Larry that guarded him his junior year when Larry was between 6'1" and 6'3", and he kept Larry from scoring. So now the same kid scoring against or guarding Larry when he's 6'7", and his comment to me when he's telling me the story, he said, "Well, nobody could stop him in the NBA, and I couldn't." It wasn't possible by that time either. At that point in time.
no, it's good because there's a lot there. Like I think on one hand with the coach, it kind of is like that Steve Jobs. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking back. So you kind of have to walk the path and have faith or whatever. So like I guess with him, it was just that missed opportunity. I also think with Larry Bird, the allowing him to become the offense is a big part of that senior year jump too, where because you're saying he improved in his passing and facilitator and becoming a playmaker being a little bit more ball dominant allowed him to play the way he's most comfortable with. I also wanted to ask a little bit because I don't know if I might have missed this, but did you pay attention to when you looked at the box offices how his defense improved a little bit? Like, how did his defense improve, becoming like a height and growing in some of those areas?
Well, I think one of the things that's missed about that is Larry got into weights. And I can see it because I used to weight train teams, and
Oh yeah,
you can be really thin and people and you lift weights and you lift them correctly and you'll get stronger. And a weight trainer can see that, that you go from 165 to 173. And most people say, well, I don't see that much improvement, but there's a big improvement. Anybody that does that will get better. So Larry was doing that between his junior and senior year. So he came in stronger, and you can see it in his muscularity if you look at it, if you know what you're looking for. And he had long arms too. So that helped him on defense. But he anticipated so well. And both Jim Jones and Gary Holland saw that when he played biddy ball. He anticipated where passes were going to go. Well, that helps your defense.
yep,
And so he had that was another gift that's somewhat underrated, I think. But it improved. Everything got better,
yep.
whatever he was doing. He was making passes that sports writers had never seen before, and they they wanted to name it. What is that? But it's the kinds of things you'd see Larry doing later at State and then for the Celtics.
No, I like that was a great point on the weights because again, basketball you really don't realize until you, especially being a weight coach, you're a weight training coach, you understand that too. Is when you actually get into the gym and start putting on that weight in a basketball, it makes the game way easier because now you're getting the ball and your first move, you're going in. Like basketball is a lot of strength on strength when you don't think about it as much as like a football or something, but it plays such a fundamental role in it. So I can especially in high school, like a lot of kids aren't lifting, so.
That's
It
right.
makes sense that Larry Bird would have that big jump, being disciplined when it comes to weights.
Especially back then. And you're right about that strength, what that equates into. What I would notice, and I was lifting weights in the late 60s in high school. I was probably the only kid out there doing it. And what I noticed was, because I didn't have much vertical jump, but coaches would sometimes say later, you sure play well horizontally. You have the best horizontal play. Because I would make room and
Yep,
I never fouled out of the game as rough as I played because I would make that contact just with my body, just leaning in.
yep.
You're a rock and they can't get around you. And sometimes you throw your hip a little bit or something like that, and they'll keep out of the middle. But yeah, there's Larry. That's probably something that's been missed about Larry's getting better. That weight training. He was in there. He was a diligent uh, person about shooting and lifting or whatever he was doing, running. He was out there doing it all the time. Again, Jim Jones telling him somebody's out there lifting more weights than you kept him going.
See?
May have hurt him some later on if he didn't lift correctly. I don't know. They always said he hurt his back putting gravel in his mom's driveway. And if you've ever seen that driveway and all the gravel, that was a long driveway. I just saw a picture of that the other day. I thought, well, no wonder he hurt his back.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the pressure? Because I and the attention that started going random. How did you talked about him being a shy individual? How did the pressure and how did he accept it as he was growing and becoming a stardom?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about it, but something certainly leaps to mind. Larry he may have loved that pressure
Mm,
because his practice, all that he was doing was preparing him for the moment of the games. And it was when he was preparing and shooting, he liked repetition. And I think people who have, in fact, Levine wrote a book about alcoholism and how it affected Larry and how it affects children of alcoholics, that they become obsessive with things. I think with Larry, it was mowing yards and shooting basketballs. And but I also think that playing in a game was that same kind of high for him. He
mm.
was completely on. He was completely in his element. Every part of him, his mind, his hearing, everything was in sync with that moment. And I bet it was an adrenaline rush. So it was a good thing, I think, for Larry. I think he sought that. I mean, you see it in the pros, that he
Real.
give me the ball, uh, and he would do that. So I think Larry was all that he was doing was leading him up to do that, and he just had the wiring for it, and maybe the experiences from childhood that made him that way. But an
Yep.
interesting question.
Good to hear. Talk to me a little bit about those lost years that we're kind of talking about now. Like, there's that everybody, I guess, was there an amount of pressure for him to go to Indiana University? Can you talk about because I understand, I guess I know Indiana State because of Larry Bird, and he's like that's why it's a pit. But everybody knows Indiana University, and can you talk a little bit about that decision making and what went into all that and why? Yeah, this is a whole area of basketball for him.
Well, when you talk about Indiana State, and it's a great school. Uh, all schools are great schools. Um, Kids need to find where they fit, and some can go to IU, some go to Indiana State, some go to Oakland City College University, where I taught, where I went also and attended. So, but getting back to Indiana State and where they were in the mix, uh, before Larry Bird, not much. After Larry Bird, not much.
Okay.
And uh, and I'm not saying that in a bad way because I love to watch basketball on any level. And so that's the beauty of basketball, isn't it? It doesn't matter who's playing. If people are working and they put time into it and they're playing well, you're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy watching that battle. But getting back to Larry, uh, Larry didn't even know if he was going to go to college. I think he wanted to. His mother certainly wanted him to, and Mark was the example that could be done. There's an interesting story there. I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard a lot of different angles on it. That during Larry's junior year, maybe between junior and senior year, Mark went to his coach at Oakland City College and said, "Hey, I got a brother. He's pretty good. Do you think he needed a scholarship here?" Because that was a big deal for that family. And the coach said, "Is he good or is he great?" And Mark says, "Well,
Wow.
he's good." He said, "We got good. We need great." So they missed the boat. So nobody was watching for Larry coaches until probably the end of Larry's junior year when Indiana State went to see Steve Land play. And Steve was getting offers from Indiana State and Ball State and Tulane. He actually had a good chance to go to Pitt later on. And he did play at IU for a while, Steve did. But anyway, Indiana State came to see uh, Steve Land and they saw Larry. And Larry was decent. And he was decent enough he could have played at Indiana State. But I don't think they went after him in a big way. So at some point in Larry's senior year, probably after Jasper, um, people started paying attention. That was mainly because of a sports writer in Jasper named Jerry Burge who started getting the word out about, hey, you got to see this guy play. Now we're kind of in the Evansville area as a metropolitan area, so they started catching Larry as well. But still, this is Indiana. There's a lot of players that are getting a lot more press than Larry was. But Bobby Knight got interested,
Mm.
and he was close. And somebody said, you need to go. In fact, I think it was the only article about Larry in the Indianapolis paper. That next game, Bobby Knight was down at Shoals, Indiana, which is a very small school in the hills, to see Larry play, and he liked what he saw. Between Knight and his players and assistant coaches, I think they saw Larry play maybe 10 or 11 times that year. They wanted him.
Yeah.
And every time Bob Knight saw him or he got information from him, he just saw something else he liked. I think he told Quinn Buckner, says he's got the best set of high school hands I've seen this year. So, Coach Knight sees what he needs to see and he's going to go after it. Well, Larry didn't even know he was going to go to college. And this is a shy kid. And he's not, he's smart, but he's not hit the books very hard, I don't
Yeah.
suspect. And so he's being looked at by them, and then Purdue gets interested in him, and Kentucky for a while. Everybody really, I think he got probably hits from over 100 schools. But Bobby Knight came after him hard. And Larry said later, he said, Indiana State was the place that I thought I wanted to go if I was going to go somewhere.
Mm.
But he wasn't even sure if he was even going to go. And that was a good choice for him. He could not have made it at IU, I don't believe. He didn't have the things he needed to be able to go there. And I looked at a lot of colleges myself. I had kids. You want them to find that fit. And I could have told you, IU wasn't going to be the fit. It might have been if Knight had paid more attention to Larry, but that just wasn't the way Knight did it. And let's talk about that for a moment. Larry needed a Jim Jones to care about him and to check on him. As tough as Jim Jones was, he was checking on Larry all the time
Yeah. Yeah.
and making sure he was doing what he needed to be doing. Gary Holland was the same way. So he always needed that kind of father figure to help him. And he goes up to IU, and that's the big campus. And he ended up rooming with Jim Wiseman, who was a fairly wealthy family out of Chicago. And Larry in his book Drive talks about how few clothes he had. I think all he had was a few pair of jeans to wear there. No dress clothes or anything like that. And Coach wasn't there. Coach wasn't mean to him, just Coach wasn't there.
Yeah.
Neither were any assistant coaches. So you're on your own. That's the way the system worked. Larry said later in a newspaper article I found, and I'm probably the only one that ever found this. Larry said my real reason for leaving was we didn't have any money. We didn't have a car. My family didn't have a car. Can you imagine? And we didn't have any money. My mom was working 2 and 3 jobs. My dad wasn't dependable. And I got a bill for a PE class that wasn't paid by my scholarship, and that was it. That was it. I didn't have the money, and they weren't going to give me the money. And I thought, okay. So he came home, and he wasn't going to college. He just came home. And he ended up coming home, and his mom and dad had gone to Oakland City to see Mark play. So Larry went with a friend of his, and when the mom saw him walk in the room, he didn't tell anybody he was leaving. She didn't talk to him for like 3 months. She was so angry that he'd quit school. Meanwhile, his uncle, this would be his mom's brother, got him got with a coach at a little school in where Larry lived called Northwood Institute. It had been a 4-year school. Oakland City played against him, and then it became a 2-year school. So it was a community college at that point. And Larry started playing there. Well, he didn't play there. He went to all the practices he was going to play there. And then he quit. He just quit right before the first game. Coach didn't know where he was at. The mom called the coach. Coach said, I don't know, because she was looking for him. He went out and got his own job. He decided, hey, I don't want to do this. I'm not ready. I don't know if I'm going to go to college or not, but I'm going to work and make some money and help my mom out. So he bought his first car, and he was very happy doing that. He worked for the city of French Lick. But let's think about that for a minute. He couldn't make it at probably arguably the best college program in the nation,
Yep.
and he couldn't make it at arguably the smallest. He couldn't make it on either end. No coach was going to be looking at him now. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Because that just evaporated. Who's going to take a chance on that? Maybe another community college, which they did start looking at him a little bit later. So he had quit and he was really happy with what he was doing. And he says in his autobiography, Drive, I finally made an adult decision and I was going to stick with it. I knew in my gut I needed to do this. I needed to get away from all that and figure it out. And then his dad took his own life, and that just blew up his world.
Mm.
And he says in his autobiography, he said, he said, I don't know what happened the next 2 months of my life. You know, I was just devastated. But in that time, we have another guy that comes into Larry Bird's life. And again, I really believe that if this coach, football coach, Chuck Aker, hadn't come to Larry and said, Larry, you need to put a basketball in your hand. I'm playing for this AAU team. We're playing for the state championship. I'll take you there. Come, you know, I'll drive you there and we'll get you started with basketball again. And he did. And they won the AAU championship. And that still didn't put him on the radar with Indiana State, though. And that's something that gets lost in all the tellings
Yep.
that I found another angle to. It was when they played. So every year, the Indiana All-Star team to get ready to play the Kentucky All-Stars would play the AAU champ. So all these great All-Star players played against Larry's team, and Larry was the leading scorer. And the Indiana assistant coach, Bill Hodges, was there and said, oh, there's Larry Bird. How about that? You know, he wasn't there to see Larry, but he stayed and talked to Larry, and that's how Larry kind of got back into Indiana State, which is where he said later he wanted to go. And it was a great fit for him. There's a bunch of his classmates there. Tony Clark, who he played with, he roomed with him, and Danny King he played with. And they were really smart. I think Terre Haute and Indiana State just found a place for Mark, and it was a good deal.
Yep. I love to hear that. And I also want a little bit on the high school part because again, when it came to those, because he didn't win a championship in high school, right? Do you think any
No,
of the
no.
recruiting play, like all the hoopla, the recruiting during that time played into it, or was the team just not as good as the team they were playing against?
So one of the things you read in some of the books about Larry, one of them particularly, says that one of the reasons why Larry wasn't noticed initially was the competition was so weak. That's not true. Uh, there were guys that played Division One, several that played Division One basketball at the University of Louisville, two of them at University of Louisville, the one transferred to Oakland City. But there was, it's Indiana, for God's sakes, here, and so they're good. Um, so I I think that and they did win their sectional.
Yep.
Gotta go back. In fact, I want to go back and talk about that junior year. That's the reason why Jim Jones uh, quit coaching. He had the best team he'd ever had at Springs Valley, that senior-led team, and they lost in the sectional, which is the first round of state tournament in Indiana. So the next year, Larry's team wins the sectional. So they do win the sectional, but that gets you at a bigger dance. So the next level is the regional, which everybody thought they would win. Everybody thought they were going to go to the state.
Mm.
And they won their first game in a really close game against Jasper, a team they had really beat. But people were catching up with playing defense. Uh, I did a blog article on all the teams that beat Larry, and there weren't very many of them, but there were. And there were games where there were guys that played better than Larry
Mm.
at that time. So you know, Larry was still getting there, but they ended up losing the regional in an upset. The game that they were ahead with 5 points, 2 minutes to go, they had the ball in the 5 point lead, and they never scored after that, and they lost by a basket. In fact, they had the ball. If they'd scored, they would have gone ahead. But yeah, that's Indiana basketball. Well, that's just basketball for you. So that kept Larry from getting some of that notoriety, perhaps where you were
Yeah.
going with that, which if they'd made that next level, he wouldn't have had any trouble probably getting on that all-star team. And his story might have been different. He might have not gone to Indiana State. Who knows?
Yep. And then to that point, because when we talked about Bob Knight, just he's one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time. Can you talk a little bit about his coaching style and how it would have clashed with Larry Bird's personality and approach to the game during those that coming out of that, based on what you've like studied and understood about Larry Bird in those high school years?
I think Larry Bird and Bob Knight, if Bob was still here, are still scratching their heads over that. I think Larry had a lot of appreciation for Bob Knight. Bob Knight really went after him. Bob Knight sent three of his best players who ended up playing on that undefeated team. By the way, Larry would have been on that undefeated team if he'd stayed down to high school to eat pizza with Larry. That's how bad they wanted Larry. So Bob wanted him, but Bob Knight never changes. He's the way he is, and you've got to meet him where he's at.
Yeah.
And Larry was never going to be ready for that. He just didn't have the social skills to understand that or work that. He needed a lot of help. He needed, what Indiana State did is they just created his world back in where he lived. They brought in a lot of his friends were going to school there, ran around with him. That was an enclosed bubble for Larry, and it got him through college. That wasn't going to happen at IU. Uh, I guess you could raise the question of whether, and I don't think Bob Knight would have let Larry go like Hodges did and
Mhm.
King. And in fact, I remember reading when Larry first got there, uh, King saying, we're just going to let this guy, he does his thing and he's good, and we're going to go with that until we see something we don't like and we'll do something about it then. This reminds me of another instance, though, where people play things backwards. Somebody asked one of the assistant coaches how good Larry was that red shirt season. He said, "Oh, he was as good as he was ever going to be." And so I talked to a guy that played against Larry. In fact, his job was guarding Larry during that time. And I said, "What was it like guarding Larry Bird?" And he said, "Well, underneath, I could stop him." But he said, if he came across the 10-second line and shot it, there wasn't going to be any blocking that. But he wasn't doing that as much. But what I'm saying is, he wasn't there. Nobody was going ooh and ah yet. So again, Larry was getting better and learning the lay of the land, and coaches were learning how to use Larry. And there's the key to what we were talking about.
Mhm.
The coaches had to figure out what Larry needed, and they needed to give it to him. And if they did, everybody was happy. And I just don't think Bob Knight had a minute to do that. Not
Yeah.
not as a bit, we're wired the way we're wired, right?
Mhm. When it comes to stories that you are interested in telling that weren't, of this high school era, what were some of those stories that you really enjoyed uncovering that other people haven't or have missed or during that time?
Boy, there's so many. But let me tell you the ones that were kind of exciting and fun to find. So I'm still operating when I'm first starting to write, digging up this stuff in these old newspapers that nobody else has looked at. And I'm reading Larry Bird's autobiography, and he's talking about that first game. So he's never played varsity before. He didn't play most of his sophomore year because of an ankle injury. His ankle's better now. He played a little bit of junior varsity, enough that they let him dress for the game. So he's at a sectional game, and that's a big deal. No matter what level of the state tournament in Indiana, sectional, regional, semi-state, or state finals, they're all it's the dance,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of pressure. And so in those lower levels, you're playing your old competition. You're playing the local people you've competed against you don't like anyway. And so Larry's sitting there, and he hears his name being called, and he realizes the coach is putting him into the game. He said, "Oh my gosh." So he goes in the game, and here's what he says in his biography. I'm paraphrasing somewhat. He says, "I go in the game, and boom, I hit a long one. Pandemonium. Boom, I hit another one. Boom, another one. I'm rebounding and I'm passing and I'm playing defense. I'm scoring. And then I score the two winning foul shots. And the next day, the paper says Larry Bird saves the day." Well, Kyle, I was pretty damn excited about finding those articles. I just couldn't wait. So I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked. Where are these things? And then I find the box scores. Larry, in one box score, it said he was 1 out of 9. And another box score, it said he was 2 out of 9.
Wow.
But he did hit the winning free throws. And I couldn't find the headline until I looked in one across the state in Louisville in the Courier Journal that said Steve Land, who scored 28 points, to Larry 6, land and bird propel Springs Valley. So what happened? And then I finally found a narrative in a really small newspaper, and I ended up really liking the sports editor because he was just gave a lot of detail. But he
Mhm.
said this. He said, and the surprise of this game was a sophomore named Larry Bird who came in and made two quick baskets underneath and did some great passing, and that kind of changed the momentum of the game. And then he scored the two winning free throws. So was he the hero? Yes. Was it on the same level that he remembered? No. And I want to add one more thing to that. Uh, I have a memoir I wrote about my high school days when I was a senior and how it drew my father and I together. And when I started working on that, finding these box scores and finding those new old newspaper articles, I'd already outlined the story. I was stunned about how often I was wrong in my memory.
Oh, wow.
And sometimes I was wrong about how good I was, and sometimes I was wrong about how bad I was. I mean, I was just stunned all the way around. I would say 50% of the time I just didn't quite have it right. And I would have staked my life like that was the way it was. So this is Larry too. But the main thing about that story is it's how Larry remembered it that makes the difference. And that's true for all of us. It's how we remember it and what we draw on it for the rest of our lives that makes that kind of difference. There were other games. This was an interesting one because this is another story that's been wrong in all the article or biographies about Larry. So the big iconic game in Larry's senior year was against Lagodi, where I taught. That's
Okay.
another reason why I I, I saw Larry when he would go to Oakland City, but I saw him play in high school because I was teaching at Lagodi. And this was a game at Springs Valley, 2,700 capacity, over 4,000 people in that gym. It was hot and you couldn't move. And this game is talked about in all of the books about Larry because this is the one Larry wished he had back. So in all those stories, it says that Larry, back then you had jump ball underneath a basket if the ball got tied up.
Okay.
Larry got the tip and he went and he scored at Lagodi's basket at the wrong end. And according to the book stories, this was the difference in the game, the point differential. That's not true. And when I read it, I said, that's not true. I was there. He walked. I remember him walking. And they called it off because that was pivotal that didn't count because it would have been it was a nip and tuck game. Another sports writer caught something that it's everybody else missed, and I put it in my book. He said the key moment in that game was when a kid, I know who the kid was, I had him in class, he looked like a football player. He knocked Larry out
Mm.
for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 seconds. Larry was down, he was not responding. So they had to, Springs Valley had to call a timeout. And that was the difference in the game. At the end of the game, uh, Larry's team had the lead. They had the ball. All they had to do was hold it. And a guy kind of got in the corner and he couldn't pass anybody and he called a timeout. And they
Mm.
got a technical. Two shots and the ball back, and that was it.
Wow.
So those kinds of things were fun to find. Uh, and there were just several things about Larry that I found people saying that, boy, if they'd only known what they were talking about. Some of those passes that he started doing, that was in there. I mean, sports writers didn't even know how to describe it. And you
Yeah,
would see,
that makes
read the
sense.
different ones. And then somebody scored, they just didn't quite, they didn't have any films to kind of go back and see what it was that he did. I think in one, the ball was going out of bounds and he got to it and he got it behind his back and he flipped it from behind his back clear down to the end where a guy got and scored underneath. And,
See.
you know, Larry Bird could do it, but nobody else is doing that in that day and age, that place. But
Talk to me a little bit about the when you looked at all these box scores. I know that in NBA today, you see these crazy stat stuffers. You have Nikola Jokic, you have Joel Embiid, you have all these people that put up Luka Doncic, another good example, or LeBron James. They'll have 35 points, 27 rebounds. It'll just be crazy, or like a Wilt Chamberlain stat line. What was some of the craziest stat lines you saw from Larry Bird when you're doing some research?
so you did see that with Larry uh, back before there was a 3-point line, but he was scoring. I think 57 was his top, 56 or 57, which got broken last year.
Oh, wow.
And this is interesting because the kid that broke it, everybody was saying, "Wait a minute, now he had a 3-point line." So I went and looked at the shot chart. He only had two 3-pointers. The rest were all underneath. He earned them. It was an overtime game against a good
Mm,
team. Um, and he broke Larry's record by a point. And then a guy had all of Larry's shot charts. Can you believe that? He
wow.
kept, I know a guy that's got all Larry's shot charts if you want to see where he was scoring these things. But I looked at his and I figured out if there'd been a 3-point line, he would have gotten about two 3-pointers, though some of them were out, but these were the farthest ones out. Um, so, my comment to the people was, hey, there's no asterisk here. He broke the record. That's just the way it is. But Larry had that record for 50 years. So that's my point. Larry was putting up those big scores pretty consistently. And that enabled him on the downside, I guess, because Gary kind of left him in there. That's what the fans wanted, Coach Holland. It allowed Larry to break Steve Land's records that had only been set for
Like a year or two.
a year. And poor old Steve, he got wiped off the face of the earth as far as people remember him because he would be revered if that hadn't happened. And you go there with that. I speak about that in my book. Um, so I remember interviewing a guy. He and his brother were in a band, and they were both played high school basketball. And they were there at Larry's last home game, and they were going to play. They were from another school, and it was toward Terre Haute, quite a few miles away from where Larry was at. And so they'd never heard about Larry. You just didn't have uh, Facebook and all the different things that
Yeah.
you get all that information around. And so the friend I interviewed, he said, I was in there getting ready to set us up to play for a dance. And my brother came back and he said, my gosh, you got to come in here and see this guy play. I've never seen anything like it. Uh, and and Jeff just said, oh, he's just lucky. And so they go in there and they watch, and Jeff said his brother looked at him and he said, "Who is this guy?" Because they'd never heard of him before, which is interesting, isn't it? Just
Mm,
how word just didn't get around because those two communities were probably maybe 70 miles apart, not that far, but they did not know that the other guy existed. Larry just didn't get any coverage in Indianapolis or up north, and it's kind of interesting how all that played out, but it all ended up for the good because I think Indiana State was the perfect place for him to go.
wow. I got two more questions, and then I just want to talk a little bit about your writing on the book and your how you thought about it. But one of the things that we can't talk about Larry Bird without also talking about the Magic, Magic Johnson, kind of their legendary rivalry. How much of that rivalry was foreshadowed in Larry Bird's early years? That there was this other player that he had to prepare for, and the kind of that whole moment of basketball that kind of took basketball NBA
Well,
to the heights.
think about that. Jim Jones, there's always somebody out there shooting that extra basket. That was Magic Johnson. Did you know? And I was stunned. I was stunned. I started, I was going to do another book on Larry Bird's college days, and I see where two people are doing that now, and I've got other things to do.
Yeah.
Let him do it. But in doing that, I started looking at Magic Johnson. You know what his number was in high school?
Magic was it 33?
It was 33.
Yep.
You know what it was in college?
30,
It was
33, right?
33.
Yeah,
It
it's
was
still 33.
33. Yeah, now he didn't get 33 when he played pros like Larry.
No.
Isn't that eerie?
Yeah.
It is to me, and they're bookends. They match each other. Both of their Larry worked for the city and Magic with his father, who had a job, I think, working in one of the auto factories, but he also hauled off garbage and so forth. But there was a lot in common. I think the one thing that wasn't in common was the family and community support
Mm,
that Magic had. It was tremendous, and I think that's what made him so outgoing. Just such a just such a beautiful human being, and so opposite of Larry, who would look down. It's probably even today, he's just not a talker, and I think he knew it. But there was something, and you can see it when you look at those pictures that were taken of them when they first met before they played in that final game. The photographers were coming in. You could see something there. It was almost haunting. You could see Magic's big smile, and he's over there and he's kind of placed himself. He's leaning toward Larry. He likes people, and there's Larry, and he senses that, and he has this kind of soft look on his face. He doesn't. It's like he's not seeing this guy as a rival, and he seems comfortable too. So I think you can see that starting right there. Just their personalities, their drive was completely similar,
Mm,
and they loved the results. Uh, I think for Larry, it was probably more life threatening not to have that because of what he was fighting, all the demons and ghosts of his past. Whereas I say Magic Johnson had more community, more support there. Stayed at his home, stayed at Lansing and played there. Uh, so there were differences, but even those differences, I think, drew them together. And they were just waiting to happen. I think that's another thing in Larry's life, and I guess in Magic's life too, that those two guys were just waiting to meet. And
yeah.
when they did, it was special. We'll not see anything like that again, I don't think.
Yeah, that's well said. And then on the last part, because you studied Larry Bird's upbringing and all that, what made Boston a perfect place for him to play? Because he never left for anything, and it seemed like he loved it there. So,
Well, his lawyer, who became his neighbor,
mm,
Wolf, became his neighbor. He wanted that, and Larry mowed his yard. People would laugh about it. Come and watch Larry mow his yard. He got to do all the things that he felt comfortable that he needed to be able to do and feel okay with it. And I think in Boston, which is considered what a blue collar, hard working town, which is kind of the culture he came from, he really knew the language and how to fit in that sort of thing. There's an interesting story, and I may do a blog on this. Larry's rookie year, the first half, maybe the first third. If you read the newspaper articles, you wonder, you see they're wondering if Larry's going to make it or not.
mm,
Now that just went on a short period of time, but in real time, you go back and you read those newspapers, people are thinking, is this guy going to make it or not? He had a little bit of a rocky start. And there's a story in Drive that kind of fits into this that he tells. So he was riding in a taxi, probably had money to go otherwise, but he's riding in a taxi. The taxi driver recognized him. He said, what are you going to do? You've got a 5-year contract. And he said, well, and I think Larry wasn't sure if he'd play longer than 5 years. But he said, if I don't make it in the pros, I've got my degree from Indiana State, and I'm going to go home and become a teacher and a coach.
mm,
That was Larry's game plan.
wow.
But being in Boston, Larry found the world he needed to thrive in. And Boston was it, not only with what he found in that town in terms of how people were, but also with his coaches and the manager and so forth. In that they let Larry, they tried to please Larry, and they did, and everybody was happy. I think that was when Larry found his place. If you let Larry be Larry, everybody's going to be
Play
happy,
well. Yep.
and that was Boston, which
Good deal.
seems kind of strange if you were betting on it right before it happened because that's a big city and Larry's Larry, but he found a niche. I mean, obviously, and he was comfortable, and that's all it took. And I think people loved him for it. I mean, they saw him as being maybe eccentric in a good way, somebody that they could identify with. He's not a rich snobby guy. He's a country guy,
Exactly.
hillbilly, I suppose you might say. What he
That's
called
a
himself, the hick from French Lick, right?
Yep. That's what made that rivalry so crazy. You just have LA, the glitz and glamour. You have
Yes,
Magic
yes.
Johnson, then you got Boston, working class, hard nose, like all just like made for a combustional. That NBA was like, oh, we're gonna sell this forever because this is just magic on the court. It's the way basketball should play. You got these two great teams. It was remarkable.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it was tit for tat too. I mean, if you look at those series and so forth, uh, there was plenty of heartbreak for both sides
Yep.
in all of that. And
Well, yeah,
that's the way it should be.
exactly.
Who wants to go watch somebody pound and win every damn game? That's no fun. You want to feel like there's something important that may be lost here that you hope you're going to win with.
No, that's right. It was a great rivalry in that sense. Yeah, both sides. And let's talk a little bit about your writing. What was your writing process like? And What does a perfect day look like when it comes to writing for you?
So I came across writing, I think accidentally. I didn't set out to be a writer. I was teaching. I started out teaching in high school. But when I started teaching in college, and one of the things that you have to do is you have to publish. And I'm a history teacher, so I thought, okay, I'm going to have to publish something in history. Well, I want to do something I like doing. And you can get really trapped in that academic world where you become an expert in something and that's all you write about, or kind of like the guy or gal that writes the best-selling book and then they ride that the rest of their life and they do book signings till they're 90 years old on the same book. I get bored. So I started writing about, I was always interested in frontier history because I grew up in Southern Illinois, and that's still somewhat a very rural area, and how it got to be that way and why people that were the way they were fascinated me. I didn't fit very well into that because I like to read and I kind of had a broader vision of the world. And I love those people and the many of the things that were a part of that culture I claim stubbornness, hang on. Nobody's better than anybody else. That egalitarianism, I always like that sort of thing. Uh, so I started writing about the frontier, and then I started writing military history, which is where it was my academic chops, where I wrote 4 books, 2 on Korean War, 2 on Vietnam. And I did very well there. That was kind of my place. If I wanted to be a big shot, it would have been continuing to write those kinds of books. There was a market for it. People liked it. And it was important to write about combat soldier stories because
Yeah.
in Korea and Vietnam, we forget about those soldiers that served there. But it was so disheartening and uh, it was sad what happened to those guys. And I thought, I want to do something that's more enjoyable. For some reason, I decided to write about my high school basketball and how it drew my father and I together.
Okay.
And so I did that book, and I was stunned about how many people were getting back to me, including a couple of people that played in the NBA that had read it and said, "This is really good." It takes me
Wow.
back to back. And what I did was I had written a very pure book about becoming uh, playing varsity on a basketball team, not the best, not the worst. I played uh, I played on a team in my high school that had the worst record. It still stands today. And then 2 years later, I played on a team that has the best record that still stands today. We
Wow.
won 25 games in a row. This is single class basketball in 1969. You mentioned Doug Collins. I hate him because they always knocked us, Benton always knocked us out of when we
Oh,
got to the
wow.
state tournament. We were a little school, and then there'd be Doug Collins. And Doug Collins was a lot like Larry Bird because I don't think he played much at all his sophomore year. I didn't see a play. In his junior year, he was okay. And then his senior year, where did he come from? And then he just kept getting better. And he grew too because he was
Wow. Very,
about six,
very hard.
seven when he came out of there and went to Illinois State and was the leading scorer in the nation. So that got me realizing, okay, if I do another book, I may do basketball. What can I do on basketball? Hey, nobody's looked at Larry Bird's high school years. And there's a reason for that, which is interesting. When people started writing about Larry, about what, his second or third year for the Celtics, they started going to French Lick and getting information.
Okay.
And Larry was still sensitive about his family. And he went back and he was God there. And I think he told people, he said, I don't want anybody talking about my family. So because they didn't talk and try to dig into the family, they also didn't look back at his high school days. And that's why there was such a room there for me to write. And so I went back and then I had access to all the old newspapers and I that's how that book uh, came to pass. So as far as writing, I always try to write something that speaks to me that I know I'm going to stick with. It's going to be important to me, and also writing that will be good for people to read that will add something to their life. I always felt like a good book should leave you an inch better than you were than before you read the book. And I think the Larry Bird book does that. It gives you some kind of a, I don't know, a joy that think this guy accomplished all this given where he came from. So that was my efforts there.
That's well said. And also, when it comes to writing your own basketball memoir, how did that experience kind of help you with writing this book? Because some maybe a parallel writing a basketball.
Yeah, I already shared the story about finding about half the things I used that I thought I knew about myself weren't true in basketball. But uh, I think that helped me when I started seeing Larry Bird's misinformation there. Some of it are not quite said correctly, that it helped me be sympathetic to that and realizing, okay, the more I can interview people, the more I can find, the better job I can do. So I guess my book was a precursor to doing the Larry Bird book. It made me able to do a better job because I knew how to get access papers. And also, you start connecting the dots. You start seeing where, wow, this led to this. For example, I went to this little grade school way out in the middle of nowhere. It's a very rural area. And then when I went to high school, it was in town. Now, this town wasn't very big, but it might as well have been New York City to me because I was so rural. So I didn't have, I think we won one basketball game when I played in grade school, and that was against a little Catholic team in Mount Vernon that had an outdoor court, and we won by 2 points.
Wow.
And I wasn't I was I was only good because I was tall and had long arms, and I would stand under the basket and just put until the damn thing went in. But I had very few skills. But the high school coach saw me coming, and he arranged for me my eighth grade year to come to the high school, and he had one of his former players who played in community college come down and teach me how to shoot a jump shot and how to make some pivot moves.
Wow.
And that man didn't have to do that, but he did it, and he did it joyfully, and he wanted me to do well. And you know, I'm very thankful to him and so many other people like that that you can forget and take for granted. But if that guy hadn't done that, and he did it cheerfully, he didn't make me feel bad. He wanted me to do better, and it made me feel good about myself. I guess I was Larry Bird with Jim Jones, and you start seeing and feeling, you see what that basketball is all about. And then the other thing I learned is, so I like to read. I live in a very rural community. Everybody farms. My brother's a year older and he can fix anything. I can't fix anything. I can drive a tractor, don't want to. Pretty good in the hayfield because I like to toss things around. Uh, and I start playing basketball, and suddenly these old farmers are coming up to me and say, "Hey, saw your name in the paper." I thought, wow, this is sweet. And so you start getting doing that. And even that sophomore year when I started and we only won one game, that was probably my favorite year because I was doing something I loved, and I'd never had that kind of affirmation before. It changed my life. It gave me confidence.
Wow.
Um, and then the next year we got a new coach. We won 21 games, which was, quite a turnaround from one game. And the next year we had that really almost perfect season. We lost our first game and then won 25 more. And I had some college offers, and I was done with it. I did not enjoy my last year. The pressure of winning
Mm.
really robbed me of the joy of what I'd done. Certainly my sophomore year and my junior year were my favorite years. But those are all learning experiences that
Wow.
I guess I brought with me when I started writing about Larry Bird.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Randy, for your time. The way we always end this podcast, and you can answer it however you want, but what should be in a writer's toolkit?
Desire, confidence about writing those crappy first drafts, the willingness to rewrite again and again and again and again to get it perfect. And you're never going to get it perfect, but you're doing that. And then being open to the joy of when it starts speaking to you and you think, oh my gosh, wow, thank you, because it's almost like it's coming from someplace else. Those are not so much skill sets and tools as they are attitudes, I guess.
Mm.
But that's where how it works for me, going into that and knowing I'm going to experience that again. I think it was Waylon Jennings, somebody said, "How do you write all those songs?" And he said, "I don't write them, they make me write them." And that's kind of like a book, you get an idea and it just takes control. The one other thing I'll add to this, and it happened in my Larry Bird book, and I'll see if you can figure out who the guy was. But in every book I've ever written, in my military histories or whatever, there'll always be one person that I'm writing about that I'll end up taking up much more. They'll just come out of nowhere and kind of take over the book, and they'll end up all over the place. And in the Larry Bird book, it was Wayne Flick, the guy
Mhm.
that's
Yep.
the state trooper in the end of it. He just came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden, he's just popping up all over the place. I gave a book signing the other day, and there were a bunch of older people there. And I said, "How many of you people know Wayne Flick?" And I bet 90% of them laughed and smiled. So he's quite a character, but people can do that. So that will happen, I think, in books. There'll be somebody like that who's got just some kind of special personality that they're kind of weaving in and out of life that people are running into, sort of thing. That's a neat thing that happens too.
Yeah, that's funny you said that because we interviewed Jonathan Ive. He wrote the book King of Life, and he was talking about how he wrote all of Martin Luther King stories. But he said in doing that, one of the people that he felt like he wrote another biography about was Martin Luther King's dad, because that's
Yes.
kind of how it happens when you write those books. There's all these other characters that play fundamental roles in people's lives.
Well, it tells us we're connected, and we never know where greatness is going to come from, nor do we ever know really where help's going to come from. It can come from just like the guy that took the time to show me how to shoot a jump shot. And I he died before I was able to tell him thank you, but I did a blog about that, and his daughter read it and got back with me, and she said, "I really appreciated that." I said, "Well, that meant a lot to me too." So,
Wow, I love to hear it. Randy, thank you so much again. Make sure everybody gets your copy. As if by magic, we'll make sure to put in the links below. It was truly a pleasure, and thank you so much for your stories, your time, and just yeah, everything. Appreciate you.
okay, I loved it. Yeah, enjoy it. See you.
Sounds